The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. State governments are facing a crisis. Healthcare, education, and transportation needs grow each year, and so do taxpayer expectations. How can state governments meet the challenges of the future while keeping the promises of today? To find out, Policy Watch is joined this week by Nancy Kopp, the Maryland State Treasurer. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Nancy Kopp, Treasurer of the State of Maryland. Welcome to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Thank you. Good to be here.
For this program, we're joined by students from the University of Maryland and specifically its public leadership class, and we are delighted that you all are here. So I have seen the word Treasurer of the United States and Treasurer of the State of Maryland, and of course, I get a check from the State of Maryland. What does the Treasurer do besides sign checks?
Besides signing your checks?
Yes.
Yes. Well, the interesting thing about state treasurer is that the job is very different from state to state. The way the treasurer is chosen is different, and the functions of the treasurer differ significantly, although there are some core functions, I think, in every state. In Maryland, the treasurer is responsible for investing the cash of the state, the working cash. From day to day, we have a portfolio of $3 to $4 billion. Billion with a B, that comes in, that's used to pay for government every day. But while it's not being used, it's invested, so the taxpayers benefit. So we do that investment, and on the other hand, we also borrow money. We take the state to the bond market. Maryland, you know, has a AAA bond rating, which is the best that
I thought you'd get
you can
that.
get. Yes, but we do borrow money, particularly for construction, school construction, university construction, that sort of thing. Finally, we have the insurance for the state, so that if there are potholes and you happen to drive on one and you bend your wheel or something, we're the people that you go to and try to get money from. Then, in addition to those things, in Maryland, as you know, Doug, the treasurer, who is elected by the legislature, is part of a triumvirate. The treasurer, the governor, and the comptroller constitute the Board of Public Works. And that's the board that has to approve of all the major procurements of the state, all the contracts of the state. And when the state sells timberland or sells things, that board, including the treasurer, has to approve them. This is unusual.
That's
it's unique,
unusual.
In fact.
What's the reasoning behind something like that?
Well, I think it's tied into the fact that the treasurer is elected by the legislature. In Maryland, the governor has about the strongest budgetary power of any governor throughout the country. The governor in Maryland writes a budget, hands it down to the legislature. The legislature can cut it and can work with the governor to reshape it and have their priorities incorporated into it. But they can't add funds to it, and they can't themselves move funds around. So that's a very significant power, if you believe, as I do, that the most important legislation that the legislature passes every year is the budget.
Power of the purse.
The budget is the heart of government. That's a very strong power. And then the next stage is the spending of the money, the actual spending, the paying people, the buying things, the sometimes selling things. And I think that one of the major reasons that we have the Board of Public Works is so that the legislature, which, remember, elects the treasurer, can have at least ears and eyes and a say in the actual contracts and the spending of state money. Because in most states, those decisions, who actually gets the money, who gets to do the job, is decided by the governor, usually behind closed doors. And that shines sunshine on the use of state funds in a way that doesn't happen in most states.
Well, I should ask you, you mentioned that Maryland's bond rating was AAA.
Oh, yes, I did. Did I?
Yes. Did you hear that in Wall Street? How is our long-term health? What's the health of the state? Because many states seem to be teetering on long-term financial problems.
Well, there are two aspects. First, the economy of the state of Maryland. We have a very strong economy. And actually, it's in large part, I believe, because of institutions like the University of Maryland and the Hopkins and a very well-educated labor force. We have more PhDs in the state of Maryland than any other state per capita. I mean, we're not California. So we have a very strong economy. However, the tax revenue don't always mirror the economy, so that sometimes we don't have the taxes coming in that you would think a state of our health would have. This is partly because Maryland, like almost every other state that has a sales tax, taxes goods but not services. And since we're really a service economy, you think of services including lawyers, advertising, doctors, that aren't taxed, you're taxing smaller and smaller proportion of the total economy. Also, in the late 1990s, we cut our income tax rate, as did many states, so that's about $600 or $700 million a year that is not coming into the state that would have if we hadn't cut taxes.
We should for the audience, we should remind them, not for political reasons, but simply to understand that this is a very widespread phenomenon, that this was a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature.
Oh, you bet. Yes, yes. And many, many states in the 1990s, you recall, things were going very well in the 90s, cut taxes then, and then the stock market fell, and then tax revenue went down, and meanwhile we had cut our tax base. All this going to say,
yes,
we are a strong state, but in the 90s, in the early 2001, 2002, we made some promises, including enhanced funding for our public school system. And while we're doing very well right now, in fact, we have a surplus. If you look at near-term out years, I don't think it's a technical phrase, but it's what my guys use.
Soon.
Soon, 2009, 2010. In fact, if we don't do something, we're going to have less money coming in than we are right now scheduling ourselves to pay. In other words, it's not, you can change the law, but unless you want to change the law to say we're going to invest less in education and we're not going to provide the match that we should for Medicaid, we're going to have to probably do something about revenue.
Well, this is not only replicated in state after state, it's the national problem.
We're still better off than most.
It's the same problem,
The
right?
state of Maryland is stronger and better off than most states, and certainly than the nation as a whole.
But let's talk about the larger generic problem, which is, you call them promises. They're whatever they are, they're there, and if unchanged, they mean vastly increased spending on whether it's Medicare or for the federal government, Social Security. There are all these programs out there, many of them not means tested, just to kind of push that a little bit, which is to say, regardless of how wealthy a person is.
Although I will say in the state of Maryland, the two things that are the most significant, aid to education and Medicaid, are in fact means, they're not means tested, but they are funding for targeted funding,
sure. Yeah. We've made a set of promises as a society,
right.
Not just Maryland. Maryland
right.
keeps its rating. And I wanted to get to the political question of how we resolve this. You said, well, we either, change the promises. Let's not say.
Of course, if we're the federal government, we borrow more and more and print more and more money.
I want to push you a little bit on this because you pushed back pretty hard. There are many elements of the promises that we've made that aren't that well targeted to low-income or middle-income families. And I'm happy to move away from that subject, but I do open
Oh, no,
that
I'm
up.
happy to. Well, I mean, one of them is tax cuts.
Mm-hmm.
I happen to not think that we have to have all the tax cuts that President Bush has promised for all the upper income folk. Among them, people to whom I'm related, I must say. But when you have important needs in society, I think we all can pay our share, and I don't think you have to cut all of those taxes.
Recently, there was a presidential commission on tax reform, and they proposed not getting rid of the mortgage deduction,
I saw that,
but capping it at $300,000 or $400,000.
Well, of course, in my home county, Montgomery County, Maryland, $300,000 or $400,000 doesn't go as far as it used to in buying a house. I mean, the cost of housing is a terrible problem, actually, because in our areas, but more and more throughout the state of Maryland, we're having trouble finding good housing for our teachers and our firemen, our policemen, the people we need in our society. It's a real problem. But the idea in principle of a cap on the deductions, I happen to personally think makes sense. But, I'm a liberal Democrat, Doug, and I know we're not all.
Well, it sounds as if the conservative president, the Republican, might be interested in it too. But in doing that or proposing that, and your being in favor, reminds me of the fact that no matter how much we seem to be in favor of common sense corrections to the problems we face, whether it's raising revenues, raising taxes, targeting benefits a little better, or changing the tax law, it does look as if we are, at the federal level, unable to come together, Republican and Democrat. How much of that has spilled over to the state level?
It varies from state to state. As you know, I was in the legislature for 27 years before I became treasurer and was very active in national organizations of state legislatures. Talking to my former colleagues and folk from around the country, I think this enhanced partisanship, and not just partisan, but bitter partisanship, has infected a number of state legislatures, and there's surely more of it in Maryland than there was in the past than there was when I was in the legislature. That's partially because we have a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature, but I think it goes more deeply than that, and we've discussed this before. I think it's tied to some extent to redistricting, and we now have districts that are more solidly Democratic or more solidly Republican, and it is very hard to be a moderate under those circumstances.
Because if you are a moderate, let's kind of lay that out a little bit. If you are a moderate, what happens is you get a challenge from
in the primary,
from the left of your party or the right of your party.
Yeah.
So you tend to take an extreme.
And you can certainly see this in Congress, and to some extent, but I think a lesser extent still, in the state legislatures.
And probably it's no accident that most of our moderates in either party are in swing districts. That is the definition of what generates a moderate. So that in this coming election, in the national election, there may only be 10 or 15 districts in the Congress that are seriously in contest, unless there's a tidal wave against the Republicans. People say it will be extremely difficult to dislodge any of the incumbents. Sometimes it seems to me the media doesn't help. When I read a news article, there's always someone at the far extreme on one side of the argument and someone on the far extreme on the other side of the argument, whatever it is, slots or whatever, to take a Maryland example. And I keep waiting to find out what's the position of the people in the middle, and I never hear about it.
And that doesn't mean there aren't people in the middle. When I was in the legislature, I used to complain about this from time to the reporters. And one of them said some years ago, you have to remember, did you ever take an English course? Yes. Did you ever learn about writing stories? Yes. Well, do you remember that in a story you need a protagonist and an antagonist and a conflict and a resolution? That's a story. You can't say, here are some questions that are very difficult and people are working on them in a moderate way, and maybe down the road they'll make progress towards answering them. You've got to have A versus B, a problem and a solution. I think life isn't always like that. If the answers were that simple, we would have solved them. But you really don't get that in the media, and particularly when you have, was it 30-second, 15-second spots? It's hard to be very deep in 15 seconds.
And especially now with cable and all these cable stations where the louder you shout seems to define whether you get on these shows.
Well, it's interesting. Marshall McLuhan talked about the global, essentially a global village, but I think, in fact, we are creating very, very narrow neighborhoods across the globe, because you can look at a cable station that just addresses your own personal predilections and interests and never have to look at what other people think.
And this is carried over actually into publishing now. There are publishers who publish liberal books and publishers who publish conservative books, and they sell to their audiences.
Well, they are sometimes enjoyable. I mean, the movies, look at...
Yes, yeah, well, enjoyable, sometimes embarrassing for both sides. But now the effect, we have an audience of younger people here, students, and what I read is that young people, meaning from our vantage point, anyone under 40, are progressively being turned off to politics. A plague on both their houses is what I hear.
Well, we read that, but that's not actually my experience. I actually have found more and more. I think that was happening at one time. I have a son who's in graduate school now, so I encounter a lot of students. I think people are more interested in public things and in the community. Maybe not always in the traditional Democratic versus Republican party fights, but I do sense that a lot of the students I talk to understand that the world is very difficult and that there are problems to be solved and the stakes are very high, and that they have a real interest in how things work out, whether it's in your community or across the globe. And actually, I sense engagement. I think there is a feeling of frustration that the people who are there now are not doing a terrifically great job solving all the problems, but not necessarily that the problems are not there or are not ours all collectively to
Well, let's
address.
explore that for a minute. I think that's my experience as well. The distinction I would have made would be between our generation's interest in government solutions, and I think this generation, which is much more interested in volunteering themselves or looking for other solutions.
I tell you, I'm sort of embarrassed speaking about this generation in front of people who are this. I mean, I am not sure I've got a lot of business doing that.
We'll hear from you in just a few minutes.
But I think knowing that there are many different arenas in which to address problems. I mean, the whole growth of the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, and the tremendous increase, even in America, of people who have had some experience abroad, I think shows a level of engagement, and it does go beyond simply government, but nonetheless, we do elect our representatives to make public decisions for us, and I think to not engage in government as well as in all of these other things would be a terrible mistake.
Right. And why don't I ask you that question, which is a little bit like sending a softball over the plate. Let's talk about young people being engaged in government. What should they do? What kinds of things do you recommend that they think about, the kinds of things that they do to get involved?
Well, I don't know that it's a softball. I mean, I think it's a really basic question. There are several things. One is your local community, political parties, not only to follow what the political leader said, but to go in and change things and to get closer to your hand on the handle of power, of decision making. I always think people should engage in politics from the bottom up, but also from the top down. That is, things like writing letters to the newspaper, things like going to your representative's office or home and saying, I'm here I want to tell you what I think, and then I want to understand why you are saying and doing what you are doing. My experience was at the state level. I always think people should engage in politics from the bottom up, but also from the top down. That is, things like writing letters to the newspaper, things like going to your representative's office or home and saying, I'm here I want to tell you what I think, and then I want to understand why you are saying and doing what you are doing. My experience was at the state level. And I will tell you, if we got more than 6 to 8 letters on any one issue, other than the hot button issue of the moment, whether it's gun control or abortion, that was a landslide. I mean, we just didn't hear very much and had to really work to try to elicit, because we were interested in what our constituents were thinking. People who are willing to engage can make a big difference. I mentioned my son in graduate school, who really, the whole time I was running, was not as actively engaged as I would have thought he might be.
You mean stuffing envelopes?
Right, which is important, very important. But actually was one of the people who became switched on by Howard Dean, but then went beyond Howard Dean to become more active and interested in political issues as a whole, both at the state and national level. And I think he was surprised to find how easy it was to engage and to get people's attention. And the real problem is trying to communicate to your friends, to your colleagues, to your peers, the fact that you can make a very big difference in pretty short time.
So say there's a congressional election, and it's in one of those swing districts where votes count. And there's
right.
And I care about one of the candidates or the other. What do I do besides making a financial contribution? And I know that's important.
That's important, but just as important is to go to the office or go to the candidate. Every congressional candidate, particularly in a swing district, which are not the huge rural districts usually, has to go door to door to meet people. They have to hand out literature. They have to get groups interested in them. It is very easy to join a campaign and make a significant difference. And even if you start out addressing and stuffing envelopes, and unfortunately an awful lot of that is done by companies now, by contractors, not by the volunteers. But volunteers are absolutely essential. And you start out by stuffing and addressing envelopes, and you end up by driving the candidate around, by speaking for him, by going door to door, by taking people to the polls, and the whole time trying to explain and articulate why you support this candidate, and if there are issues about which you have some question regarding his or her stand or position, to try to make a difference in it. And you can.
That's all. I think that's great. That's all during the campaign. Let's assume our candidate wins, or there's another candidate.
Well, the unfortunate thing about Congress, I think it's unfortunate, is that it's just about a perpetual campaign. When you have but a 2-year term, and you have to raise money all the time and go around all the time, one of the problems, I think, is that they don't have time to not be campaigning.
Now, you were a Hill staffer in the House?
A long time ago.
But people still do that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. The offices couldn't work without the interns and the young staff. It's absolutely essential, and they are doing everything from making contact with the public to doing research on issues, to helping draft testimony, and working in the districts. I mean, you can both work in Washington and in the district and try to get people, as I say, engaged in your candidate and in your campaign and in your issues.
And at least my informal research by looking around the halls of Congress.
They're very young, aren't they?
They're very young.
Yes.
Well, of course, these days, everyone looks very young,
yes.
but they are young.
But there really is a place for youth, both because of energy and because a lot of them are college students or graduate students who know how to do research quickly.
And that's one of the key skills, to be able to turn something around. A letter comes in, or this week it's about Katrina or whatever, and tell me something about seawalls.
Right. Right, and there are, as I say, there are really great opportunities to make a difference in how things are done.
Now, you've made a difference. You've been tremendously successful. You mentioned 27 years in the House of Delegates here in Maryland.
I've been around a long time. Success, somebody else has to judge.
Now, any regrets? Do you wish you had gone into the arts or something else? What else would you have done?
Well, one of my problems is almost everything I look into turns out to be very interesting. Mm-hmm. So I would like a number of different lifetimes to do a number of different things. I've always been interested in astronomy and archaeology, maybe because they start with A and I haven't gotten to, but I've always been interested in a lot of different things, and I think almost anything you really immerse yourself in is fascinating. But I can't imagine anything more rewarding for me than engaging in public issues and the public sector.
Well, on that note, let me again thank Nancy Kopp, Treasurer of the State of Maryland, for being with us on Policy Watch. Nancy, thank you very much.
Pleasure, Doug.
And to our viewers at home, let me say, if you want to write to us, it's Policy Watch at UMD for University of Maryland .edu. Nancy, thank you very much.
A pleasure.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.